All right, it's 11:05, so I'll get started. Thank you all for joining. I just want to point out, I hope that this conversation sparks some thoughts and conversations online with people post my presentation. So feel free to share your thoughts on Twitter or wherever you like to share your thoughts about voice design with the hashtag #SensitiveBots. I'll also share some slides and additional resources after my talk today there. In 2017, a company named Lifefolder invented a chatbot named Emily. And Emily's job was to help people prepare for end-of-life planning. We all know, and we probably have not done this ourselves because it's a big problem in the United States. Millions of people haven't filled out this paperwork. And Emily's job was to make this a very easy thing to do with a little 45-minute conversation that was friendly and engaging to allow users to fill out their paperwork through a conversation. Emily received coverage from many major publications, like, Vice and things like that, with potential for hundreds of thousands of users to engage with Emily to do this paperwork. Was a semi-finalist in the AARP Innovation Awards. So different industry leaders were recognizing the value of this tool to solve a real problem for aging populations. And she sparked conversations about the success of chatbots in sensitive contexts, just like this one. I'll share a snippet here of Emily in her conversations, making the grim conversational, but she really did a good job. She followed the conversational principles that we have outlined in some publications that we have so far, as this is a growing field, in being conversational, having a good persona, and making it a friendly and exciting conversation for an otherwise, grim and boring topic. But if you go to speak with Emily today, she doesn't work anymore. She doesn't exist. And instead, she'll route you to an article from her founder's Lifefolder about why the company, only a year or so later, no longer exists and why they believe that they failed. And they share some metrics about usage, which ultimately financially led to their failure. Out of those potential hundreds of thousands of users from all of that national coverage, only 1,500 users really did engage with Emily ultimately. And out of that 1,500, only 31% completed that full 45-minute interaction to fill out their paperwork. So of all of that buzz, ultimately, nobody really took the leap and used her to her full potential. I think not only was there a financial problem here, but when we're designing for sensitive contexts like these, relying only on our principles of good design that we've outlined as an industry so far will fail us. There's a little bit more to the puzzle that I'll uncover today that I think could have helped Emily achieve success. So what do we consider good design today? How do we measure success or qualify a conversational design to be a good interaction? Well, we look to conversational principles to guide us in tricky situations just like these. You might have heard of Grice's Cooperative principle. In almost every publication that's come out about voice design in the last several years, as a toolkit for voice designers entering the field and to know if they're designing a good human interaction, someone will mention Grice's Cooperative principle. And in Grice's Cooperative principle, he outlines 4 maxims of a good, successful, ideal conversation, which we as human-computer interaction designers adopted for computers to be as human and successful as possible. Those 4 maxims are with quantity, to give just enough information, with quality, to be truthful, the maximum of relation, to give relevant information, and the maximum of manner, to be brief and not provide more information than is being requested in any back and forth. One could assume, if you read all the new publications that are coming out in voice design, that if you follow these maxims, you would be designing a good voice interface or chat interface or conversational interface. And Erica Hall, in her recent book, Conversational Design, actually referenced these. And she built on these and explained a little bit further about what she feels are, features of an interface that would make it good and conversational, adding that it should be cooperative and goal-oriented, context-aware, quick and clear, turn-based, truthful, polite, and error-tolerant. And I really recommend you go and read her book because these are all true things. If you do incorporate these into a conversation, they will simulate a human conversation and make it easier to interact with. She goes on to say that any system with some kind of human interface or human-like interface, if they adopt these principles, can be more of a friend or a pal. And that's true. But I think in designing for these sensitive contexts, specifically on behalf of healthcare organizations or large businesses, our end goal really isn't to be friends with users. It's not the same as two human beings interacting and having a conversation. We're not taking into account the authority, power dynamics, and the social engineering we employ as designers to get users to perform some kind of task. In Emily's case, there's probably a financial incentive to get people to fill out their end-of-life paperwork so assets don't go unclaimed when people pass away, for example, while users' goal is to simply fill out something that's boring. I believe in this way because our goals are not aligned with users. We have different goals than what the users we're interacting with have. We can truly never design truly equitable interfaces with the principles we've outlined today. Atefi Hadi, a linguist from the University of Monash University in Australia, agreed, and she was thinking about this in 2012 with her critique of Greece's cooperative principle. She references other linguists who also had these thoughts, but they're breaking down the idea that a successful conversation actually rests on the tension between the goals of a communicator and an audience. In Grice's cooperative principle, as it exists today, those principles apply to a conversation in kind of an ideal world where both communicators and audiences have the same goal. But like I said, as we all know, when we're designing for these business contexts, we don't necessarily have the same goals as the users and patients we're trying to provide for. Additionally, some other linguists that she referenced in her article agreed and said that these maxims don't also take into account the social position of speakers in this perfect world. So if two interlocutors were having a perfect conversation and were the same social standing in the same class and the same had the same goals of a conversation, perhaps those maxims would make a good conversation. But those maxims don't take into account the power and the manipulation we can employ over other users when we're having a real conversation. And I think particularly in these sensitive contexts, we need new principles to account for that. For these principles to work, users need to share our business goals, and they won't. They'll always be a little bit different. So if I could redesign the principles, I would like them to be a little bit different. I think that all conversational interfaces should be aware of the power dynamics and history at play with any given problem you're solving, that they should be customizable conversations to user preferences and adaptive to user needs as they're making their way through a conversation, that conversational interfaces in these sensitive contexts should be integrated to real-life resources or other mediums, allowing for escalation or exits from just the conversational interface I've designed, and that they should be transparent with user data and choices, particularly when users are giving up this really sensitive patient data or other, private information to us in order to provide some service back. So I'll walk through some examples of companies that I think are doing a good job of each of these principles I proposed, or doing a not good job, and that I think is an illuminating example. So how can we be aware of power dynamics at play in our designs? I don't think we have good principles for these outlined yet in the voice design field, but a company or a team that is doing a good job of this now is the Creative Reaction Lab out of St. Louis. They're a social impact design firm, and they've invented what they believe to be an alternative to the human-centered design practice called the Equity-Centered Human Design Framework. And it looks really similar to the processes we employ for designing, things like rapid prototyping and ideating and launching and testing and kind of completing that circle over and over again. But the two flavors that they add to this whole process that I think are really important are weaving in history and healing and evaluating power dynamics of situations that I don't think we take time to add into our design processes. As part of history and healing, they introduce a phase of a process where you actually, as a designer, explore the historical events and structural oppression that shape the problem that you're solving for. I'll share their toolkit, but they have many exercises and questions that can help prompt you as a designer when you're in the beginning phases of your design to help you think through these questions. I definitely think something like this should be adapted for the voice design field so that those questions are asked during early phases of design. Additionally, they focus on users dismantling power constructs or evaluating the power of individuals at play in a given design problem. They also have questions to lead designers through thinking through who possesses power in a given interaction In the case of Emily, for example, perhaps she had specific power or authority over users that wasn't explored and made people either uncomfortable or not as open as they would like to be. So I think these questions can really help us uncover some of those power dynamics at play in a design, rather than us assuming that we're just peers with our users. How can we be customizable to user preferences in our conversational designs? Well, I think Sensely, a patient engagement platform, they provide patient education, appointment reminders, different things like that through this friendly, engaging avatar, does a really great job. Although this is just a screenshot from a demo, what I think is really illuminating is that users can choose to interact with the avatar via text or voice, whatever is more comfortable to them. And I think this is an excellent example of designing for sensitive contexts like these. Depending on where users are, if they're at home or in the workplace or somewhere sensitive or somewhere comfortable to share information, it's integral to allow them different options for sharing data so that you can get them where it is most convenient for them. Some other customizations I think could be done that I don't see happening widely with other conversational interfaces are the speed with which we communicate with users, allowing them to adjust the frequency or the pace at which they're receiving information. Definitely the language, that's always a good thing to allow users to select their preferred language for which they would like to receive content. Allowing users to select the persona they'd like to engage with, particularly in these sensitive contexts, perhaps selecting a persona they feel more comfortable disclosing information to. Allowing users to select the frequency from which they receive information. Perhaps they only want to be engaged with some kind of patient education once a day rather than several times a day, or they might need extra help and would prefer to be reached out more frequently. And the time of day, allowing users to customize when they're getting information and updates from a system so that it fits into their lifestyle. How can we also be adaptive to the needs of users through conversational interfaces? Well, this is a negative example. Although I love Woebot, and I'll share a positive example of them later on, I think this is kind of a good illuminating example of an interface not being adaptive to needs when it should be. Woebot is an interactive Facebook Messenger bot, and you can interact with it on other platforms, I suppose. But it's a replacement, or not a replacement, a substitution or a complement to therapy. It allows users to deal with depression and anxiety through helpful cognitive behavioral therapy skill building, and checks in with you daily or more frequently if you need it to build your skills there. And although I love Woebot, like I said, I think it wasn't really adaptive to inputs that weren't expected of me. I tried to simulate a conversation where at the beginning I was letting it know I was in an emergency and needed help. And because I was saying those things at a point in a conversation when it wasn't expected, it didn't provide the assistance I needed. To truly be adaptive to needs, our conversational interfaces should expect these outs and plan for those outs and plan for either escalation to other resources or information to continue passing me through the interaction, but letting me know that it's understood that I'm in duress or distress. How can we also integrate with IRL resources or other mediums in order to give users the real help they need outside of my business goals with a conversational interface? I think a really great example is Buoy Health. They're a patient intake system, a chatbot that asks users questions about symptoms they're experiencing related to any health condition. And at the end of about 20 questions, it provides 3 suggestions for what they think customers or users are experiencing. And then a little action plan, whether they should go to the emergency room today, whether they should see a primary care doctor within the next 2 weeks, or whether they can treat it at home. But what I think is really radical about this platform is that it also recommends primary care doctors for users in their area to see providers and get real help. Although in this example it only gave me an option to see an online practitioner, I think a really radical addition to this could be allowing users to sort potentially by cost, whether it's a sliding scale practitioner or maybe a free clinic, or by distance, depending on accessibility needs. But having some options here to sort through different options to see a provider that could be actionable and help users get help that they otherwise would have found difficult to discover. Another really great example is Spot. They're an anonymous workplace harassment bot or a reporting tool. where conversations are triggered by users to report any kind of instance of harassment they've had. What I really love about this bot is it doesn't attempt to replace HR or replace a helpful ear to hear these instances of harassment, but instead it does what it does best, or what these conversational interfaces do best, is collect that information in a private way. I think it's implied and it's implicit in this interface that any of your notes are being routed to HR, and there is live support on the other end. So I really like that interface does its role well and routes to live help when it knows that's the limitation of the system. How can we also be transparent with user data and pathways through a conversation? Well, although I critiqued Woebot before, I think it does a really good job of this. It provides a lot of clarity and policies with opt-outs when you want to delete your conversation or remove private information about yourself from their system. They let you know that information up front, let you know that their creators are storing data about you and let you know that that's occurring, and then give you links to additional information to see where that lives. Additionally, when you do select to delete your information, it provides a lot of helpful information about what is happening, that the deletion is in progress, that your conversation will actually still show up in Messenger. So even though that's not part of their system, they're being proactive and letting you know all the places you should go and delete your history. I will say that when you do try to delete your information, there's a specific input that you need to say, something like delete my conversation. I think an improvement to this interface could be some kind of natural language engine that would allow users to say variations on delete my information. When you are allowing users some transparency and options to delete, it's important to let that be an easy thing, not to hide that under menus or make it difficult to trigger that interaction. So I'll share some resources to continue this conversation and to help you all think of your own principles and critiques to my principles. I think this is an ongoing discussion. This is just my attempt at fusing my own experience designing for different sensitive contexts at healthcare institutions and technology startups designing sensitive health engagements for patients, and some readings I do on equity all the time. But I believe our work is just starting. The voice and conversational design field is very new, and there are very few publications so far that outline the best practices for design. But this is what new designers entering the field will be consuming and reading and soaking up and then going out into the world to design. We need to continue this conversation and not rest only on these best practices, but continue to think about them and challenge them. I hope you all share your thoughts, like I mentioned at the beginning, on sensitive bots. Please build critique and discussion on these topics. I hope there are things you disagree with, and I hope there are things you agree with. And regardless, I think this is the beginning of formalizing and developing these topics over time. Like I mentioned, I'll share all of my resources in my slides today, as well as helpful toolkits that I'll put together afterward. But I did want to highlight a few of the references I had today. Atifi Hadi from Monash University, really great article. I definitely think you should read it. And then certainly the Creative Reaction Lab from St. Louis and their founder, Antoinette Carroll, just a genius on design practices and process that I think we all should be learning from, although she's outside of the voice design field. I wanted to leave time for questions as well, so does anyone have any questions? Yes. Mm-hmm. Interaction? Yeah, that's a good point. I like kind of waffled on whether or not I should include a critique to that, but I think it's different for every user, and that's another example of something that would be nice to personalize throughout a conversation. Maybe at the beginning of onboarding a user, getting a better sense of what they like to engage with and what they don't like to engage with, and makes them uncomfortable at the beginning, could allow you to adjust your content to be more kitschy like that or less kitschy and build people's trust. But yeah, I definitely could see some users, especially in that mental health setting, finding that alarming. Like, I'm sharing your information. I'm not a humanoid. That's weird. But I think that could be avoided by thoughtful design and question asking and customizing earlier on in the conversation to allow some variation there. Yep. Yeah, definitely. At I work at Nuance, so it's a very large company, and admittedly, we do some testing, but it's really hard to, baked into the business process to get all the testing we want to do done. When I worked at a smaller company, we had a lot more opportunity to do that, and a lot of the time, it kind of looked just like A/B tests. So putting those things out to the world and looking at engagement rates, how many more users are completing that interaction from A to B, where are they dropping off? Could that be a result of something that I designed in the middle? Is that what they're responding to and then dropping off? But again, a lot of A/B testing, a lot of listening to recordings as well to hear where disconnects are happening or users are engaging with something that we thought was really sensitively designed. But once you hear the interaction that user is being tripped up or uncomfortable with, I think also just spending more time in the interview and research process at the beginning of a design can really be helpful. When I was designing for sensitive contexts, if I didn't have time for focus groups or research, I would definitely just go online, places like Tumblr or Reddit, and go to real patient forums and see how people talked about health conditions, because sometimes adopting the language of a community that's really dealing with these issues is helpful. Yeah, no problem. Yep. Mm. Yeah. Yeah, one really good question that Antoinette Carroll and her team outlines, and I'll send all the links so that I think everyone should go purchase this little toolkit. I meant to bring it up with me, but I don't have it. Um, is evaluating who is benefiting from a particular interaction. For example, as a designer, on behalf of a company, who's getting something out of this interaction? Am I receiving some financial incentive if this interaction is completed? Is the user really becoming more healthy, or are they getting something out of this interaction when it's completed? Um, Also asking questions like, in this conversation, is a user intimidated by me on behalf of an institution, or are they traditionally used to feeling intimidated by me because my avatar is a nurse, for example, something that traditionally a user would interact with and feel some kind of intimidation about, or maybe a disconnect from, rather than designing an avatar that's like a peer. What are some other ones? There are definitely a lot of leading questions, just kind of exploring who is benefiting. Do I have power as a designer? Power isn't always bad. Do I have power as a designer or with the name brand of the company that I'm on behalf of? And how can I use that power or flex that power to convince users to do something that I think is positive, or challenge institutions or route them to things that I know they should do, but there are misconceptions about them and they'll trust me if I flex my power. So like I said, she does an even better job of explaining these things than I can, so I'll share those resources. Any other questions? Perfect. Oh, you have another? Yes, good. No, not that I'm super aware of. I haven't explored or specifically linked to behavioral economics, but yeah, my background specifically is more of a social justice community design background, so I definitely lean on that all the time, seeing the amazing work people are doing in communities and being change makers and using community leaders to do design, I think is super relevant to us as designers in this digital realm when we're designing for instances like healthcare or things like that that have a lot of similarities. Thank you all for joining. I'll share all my resources online afterward. Thank you.